All right. It is 6:05, so we will go ahead and get started here. Again, I want to thank you all for joining us. My name is Brian Hobbs. I am the project manager for MARTA on the South DeKalb Transit Initiative. And what we're going to do here today, we're going to talk to you about what we've been doing behind the scenes for this project. Many of you may know this project has been known as the I-20 East Transit Initiative, but it's now known as the MARTA South DeKalb Transit Initiative. What I'm going to do, as you can see the screen here, there are different people who are associated with this project who you can reach out to if you have questions. I'm Shirley Peart from MARTA, who is the AGM, current active AGM of planning, myself being the project manager, Greg Jafrida, who is in external affairs for our capital programs, Claudia Bilato, who is WSP, who is project manager on the project team, Grady Smith as well, and then Michael Hightower from the collaborative firm for external affairs and public collaboration. What I'm going to do first before we get started, I want to recognize Chair of the MARTA board, Chairwoman Rita Scott, and I'm going to ask the Chairwoman if she would like to say a few words before we get started.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Can't hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
You can hear me. Okay, great. First of all, as I said, good evening. And I would like to first say welcome on behalf of myself and my fellow MARTA Board of Directors. I want to say thank you for taking time out of what I know is your very busy day to share with MARTA your expectations as well as your vision of what public transit should look like in DeKalb County. Public transportation is the heartbeat of our community, and I'm extremely excited to hear from you and to get your input as to what you would like to see in DeKalb County, specifically in the area that we're talking about today regarding public transportation. I am here to answer any questions for you, also to hear from you, as I said, but please remember, I represent DeKalb County. I am a DeKalb County resident. Not only do I sit on the board and chair the board at this time, I'm a DeKalb County resident. So I have interest in what transit looks like in DeKalb County. Please, any questions you have, any concerns, feel free to ask them. And if allowed, I'll be happy to answer anything that this great team cannot, but I can tell you it's a great team. They have relied on public input, and I know that they're prepared to answer any questions or share with you any information that you may need. So thank you for allowing me to share.
Thank you, Chairwoman. As always, it's a pleasure, and thank you. So with that, what we're going to do now, I'm going to turn it over to Katrina Highsmith with the collaborative firm, and she's going to go over our virtual event participation instructions.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. I want to make sure that we also acknowledge some other people that are in the audience today with us. We have board member Rod Ryerson. He's in attendance. Thank you so much for being here. We have the former CEO of DeKalb County, Pastor Lee Mays is on here, as well as Chairwoman, Rita Scott. So thank you guys so much for being here and being engaged and involved in this project as we move the project forward. And thank you all for being here. The event tonight is going to run between 6 and 8 p.m. Please use the Q&A section to submit your project-specific questions or comments. We will address as many questions and comments as time will allow. Your input is definitely welcome, so please participate in our polls this evening. If you missed any details during the presentation, it will be posted on MARTA South DeKalb Transit Initiatives Project website. And for additional information on the MARTA South DeKalb Transit Initiative, please visit our website. The link is here, and we will also share it in the comment box so that way you guys can easily grab it. And then before we get started, we just want to make sure to see who is here this evening. So we just have a couple quick polls, nothing. see who is in the audience. So we'll just give it a few minutes, actually we'll give it a few seconds, just to see who is here. Okay, so we have a lot of people who are residents of South DeKalb that I see, and I'll share. Oh, we have a couple last people. Okay, end it. So we have about 68% of the participants here tonight that are residents of South DeKalb. So I'm very excited that you guys will be able to learn more about the project, be engaged, and ask any questions that you have. And for those who are not residents, we still appreciate you being here and being able to provide your input and feedback. And then our last poll is evening. I'll just give it about 30 seconds for you guys to be able to participate. Okay. We still have people participating. Please drop your, we still want you to participate, so please use the chat. The question is, do you ride transit to and from work or school? Okay. So we have about 30% ride transit, 39% no, and about 30% sometimes. So majority of people do ride transit. So I will thank you guys so much for participating, and I will turn it back over to Brian.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Katrina. Okay, and so with that, what I'm going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about the agenda, and then we're going to hand it over to Grady Smith, who will start us off, and then Claudia Bellato, who will also get into the presentation. So today, our agenda, we're going to talk about what is the South DeKalb Transit Initiative. As I mentioned earlier, this project, formerly known as I-20, we'll talk about why it is now called the South DeKalb Transit Initiative. So that is one thing we'll talk about. We'll also talk about what transit options have been studied in South DeKalb over the years. As you know, there have been many options looked at, so we'll talk about that. And then what are the major considerations in the planning process as we move forward to getting to a consensus on a new LPA for this project. And then we'll talk about how do you stay involved. And so with that, what I'm going to do is hand things off to Grady, and he'll kick us off.
Thanks, Brian. So as Brian said, there's been a significant amount of study over the years around transit and transit investments in South DeKalb. And the graphic you see on the screen sort of highlights many of those studies over the years. And I've had the pleasure, I'm a South DeKalb resident, and I've had the pleasure of assisting MARTA and others, including DeKalb County, on looking at transit and the needs within the South DeKalb area. So back in 2000, there was a real big focus on connecting South DeKalb to the Emory CDC area. And so that sort of started the process, the South DeKalb Lindbergh Corridor Investment Study. One of the big outcomes of that study process was clearly the need of better connecting South DeKalb to the downtown area with a secondary connection to the CDC Emory area. So over the course, moving from 2000 through this timeline, a lot of the focus shifted from that north-south connection to more of a east-west connectivity of South DeKalb to downtown. So you see the I-20 East Corridor study back in 2002, followed by some additional study in 2004, and then adoption of a locally preferred alternative of rail investment, as well as bus rapid transit investment, connecting South DeKalb, both north and south and east and west. We'll talk a little bit more about what a locally preferred alternative is later. A number of things identified in blue on this timeline is very important. These are initiatives that have been taken on by other entities outside of MARTA that influences what happens with transit investments in South DeKalb. So in 2019, we'll start in 2015, the Georgia Department of Transportation developed their first plan of managed lanes along the interstates, including corridors such as I-20 and 285. We'll talk a little bit more about the implications of their decisions to invest in managed lanes along these interstates and how that impacts transit. In 2019, DeKalb County took on its first transit master plan. And I see a number of folks on the call that were involved in those meetings back in 2017, 18, and 19, kind of developing a holistic vision for what transit should look like across DeKalb, including in South DeKalb. Clearly, out of that master planning process, there was a priority placed on addressing the needs of underserved areas in South DeKalb. And then finally, I'll mention in 2022, the DeKalb County Board of Commissioners basically adopted a resolution of support to continue to support rail transit and high capacity transit initiatives connecting South DeKalb to downtown in the greater Atlanta region. Beyond that, there's been a number of things recently to happen in addition. Commissioner Marita Johnson held a discussion, a town hall meeting in Stonecrest that was really a real candid discussion about the need of heavy rail transit in the I-20 corridor. And then also the DeKalb County Public Works and Infrastructure Committee has continued to look at transit as a priority and looking at ways to help fund transit moving forward. MARTA has also made a number of commitments beyond just looking at planning studies in the South DeKalb area. And this slide sort of highlights some of those. MARTA's an old system. It's, we're 40 years old or so. And so keeping the system in a state of good repair is a priority and a commitment that the MARTA board and the staff is working towards. So there are a number of investments happening in that regard. That includes a significant amount of station rehabilitation projects at Kensington, as well as at Indian Creek, for example, in South DeKalb. MARTA is also looking at installing an additional 150 bus shelters over the next 5 years in DeKalb County. MARTA has also made commitments to develop the first bus-to-bus transit transfer facilities in South DeKalb, one at the South DeKalb Mall area and one in the Stonecrest area. This will allow MARTA to better serve South DeKalb with local bus services. There's a commitment to look at what we're called bus rapid transit, and we'll talk more about that later in the presentation along the I-285 express lanes, connecting not only DeKalb County, but also Fulton County, as well as all the way over to the Battery in Cobb County. So there's an opportunity to make that connection across all three counties, and with a potential connection to Gwinnett. And then finally, we have to mention MARTA's continued emphasis on looking at transit-oriented development efforts along the I-20 corridor. And we'll talk more about what that is, but essentially it's looking at the types of land uses, zoning, and other incentives and regulations to spur the development that will support transit over the long haul as we make significant investments in transit along I-20 and other corridors in South DeKalb. Next slide. So what is a locally preferred alternative and what a local preferred alternative isn't? Essentially, it's the results of a planning study, a local planning process, whereby we go and we look at the various alternative modes and the various alternative alignments and identify collectively with a technical process, but also a public process, what is the preferred investment that we want to make in high capacity transit in a given area. This locally preferred alternative is the beginning step towards implementing a project and also satisfying the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, that's a process that is required by the federal government to advance transit into design and construction. So it's the beginning of delivering a transit investment to a given area. So as I mentioned, South DeKalb and MARTA had identified a locally preferred alternative in 2012. And let me talk a little bit about what that alternative included. So this graphic sort of shows the locally preferred alternative. Downtown shown in purple out to Wesley Chapel. The mode selected was bus rapid transit, so as shown in purple. And then there was also an extension of the MARTA rail from Indian Creek along the I-285 corridor, and then out I-20 to Stonecrest, shown in yellow. So this was the investment strategy that was adopted as the locally preferred alternative by the MARTA board in 2012. It's important to note that in order to advance the locally preferred alternative further through the project development process, you got to secure funds. And ideally, Claudia is going to talk a little bit later about the federal funding process and the requirements there. So this was adopted in 2012, and a lot has changed since 2012. And a part of what we're doing now, as Brian talked about, is updating. We're going through some steps to update information so that we have the latest and greatest information to advance an investment in South DeKalb transit investment. So what's changed? I talked about the GDOT plans and express lanes. You know, they adopted a plan to build express lanes, and they're building these things all over the region along their interstate corridors. So in 2015, they adopted a plan to move forward with those managed lanes, but also make other investments such as rebuilding the cab. With those investments, as you can see, many of the transit along the map kind of shows our local preferred alternative pretty much followed the interstate corridors. So with GDOT expanding the interstate, it really increases capital cost and right-of-way cost associated with building out that locally preferred alternative. Stonecrest became the most populous city in DeKalb County in 2017. That was not the case in 2012. So, you know, making sure that we understand land use and the economic development initiatives of Stonecrest is going to be a big part of what we need to do to make transit work well and make that connection to Stonecrest. The county also adopted its first BLOST. That's a good thing as it relates to transit, in that those first and last mile connections, be it sidewalk connections, safe crossings to access transit, is something now the county has funds to help build those investments and help make transit work better. I mentioned the DeKalb County Master Plan that was adopted in 2019. That not only focused on South DeKalb, it looked at investments that connect the entirety of DeKalb County internally, but also to our neighbors to the east, west, north, and south. So that is the first, and we have an opportunity now as we update the locally preferred alternative investments and other ideas about how to make a comprehensive. As I mentioned, that resolution that's been adopted by the board, that kind of sets the stage for, again, priority and focus on transit and I-20. And in South DeKalb, MARTA is taking that to heart, and this study is really all about updating the preferred alternative and finding the right investment strategy to move forward with to meet the needs of the residents of South DeKalb County. So with all of that, all those changes, one of the big changes is cost. And this slide kind of captures kind of what we're looking at in terms of escalation of cost. And I mentioned right away, because we're along the interstate corridors being a big driver of those costs. So back in 2018, MARTA did a real in-depth look at the cost of that locally preferred alternative. And back then, the BRT piece that I talked about from downtown to Wesley Chapel was estimated to cost about $84 million. And the heavy rail extension from Indian Creek back in 2018 was estimated to cost about $3.2 billion. As we look at the landscape in 2022 and all the impacts with the managed lanes, the reconstruction of the interchange at I-20 and 285 and other issues, these costs have escalated, right? So the BRT now from downtown to Wesley Chapel, it's estimated to be about 101 million. And the HRT, the heavy rail extension, the extension of MARTA rail from Indian Creek out to Stonecrest is estimated to be somewhere between 6.5 and a lot of that has to do with the right-of-ways. There's, as you know, we're dealing with escalations and inflation and materials, and there's just a lot that goes into these numbers. We're still refining these and cranking through them, but this is our latest and greatest estimate, capital cost estimate for the locally preferred alternative that was adopted in 2012. Next slide. Real quickly, this is our study area, and Brian talked about, the previous studies being only focused along I-20. We're now broadening our look at the South DeKalb area. So this map sort of illustrates our broader study area. So it includes not just I-20, but Covington Highway, and it also includes looking at opportunities for connections south, north, east, and west. So it's a broader study area, and we'll be looking at opportunities to make transit investments along these corridors. And again, updating that local preferred alternative. So this gives us a broader look, and it gives us an opportunity to bring new ideas to the table. Next slide. So I'll talk real quickly about some of the changing conditions. So this first map and this first graphic kind of illustrates the way people travel, where people are coming from and going to as it relates to South DeKalb County. So the orange arrows kind of illustrate a commute into South DeKalb. So these are trips entering the South DeKalb area, commutes into South DeKalb, jobs and opportunities. So, there's about 57,000 trips coming into DeKalb on a daily basis. Then the other look is the blue arrow, which is pretty much me. I work in Midtown and I live in South DeKalb, but there's about 62% or 114,000 trips a day leaving South DeKalb, going to other destinations, be it downtown, Midtown, Buckhead, Perimeter, Gwinnett, Rockdale, other destinations on a daily basis for their commutes. And then there's about 7%, or 13,000 of folks that live in South DeKalb and they work in South DeKalb. So their commutes are to destinations within that darker gray area shown on the map. And so this kind of this is important as we begin to look at how we make, or where we make those connections. And this information is going to really drive and help us identify our purpose and need. And Claudia will talk a little bit more about what we mean about purpose and need. Next slide. On the demographics, the good news is, and we all know if you live in South DeKalb, we're growing. Just like the Atlanta region as a whole, the population and jobs in South DeKalb are increasing, and the infographic here on this slide illustrates that. One of the other big points on the demographic side is we're diversifying. The race that we're becoming, I hear a lot of times about gentrification and other things that are starting to occur along corridors like Candler Road and other places in South DeKalb. We're becoming a lot more diverse in our population. Our housing values are increasing. Our rental rates are skyrocketing. Affordable housing is becoming an issue. We know that. And then finally, the elderly population. We have a significant elderly population in South DeKalb, folks that are aging in place, deciding to stay in South DeKalb as they age. And those folks are going to need options. And so transit could be a big part of how they plan to move around in the future. One of the big takeaways from this slide is that last bullet there about economic development and job centers, right? As I said earlier, a lot of folks that live in South DeKalb can't work in South DeKalb because we don't have the jobs there. So transit could be a conduit to bringing, relocating jobs and opportunity to South DeKalb. We're starting to see more job centers and things happen, the movie industry and other industries moving into South DeKalb. So we're looking to make that jobs to housing match better to reduce the length of commutes, and people can potentially live and work in South DeKalb, and that makes for less congestion. And that's the type of match that transit can help serve as well. Next slide. Finally, I'll talk about land use. This is a very, very important one. And in our in-person meeting, there was a lot of discussion about land use and density and all those things that are important when we look at land use and what makes transit work well and drive ridership. But the map you can see here kind of illustrates the fact that the majority of South DeKalb, that beige color, is residential. It's single family residential neighborhoods. But we're starting to see along major corridors such as Panola Road, Candler Road, at the major interchanges along I-20, along Covington Highway, we're starting to see more townhouses built. We're starting to see more economic development occur. We're starting to see things change in terms of the density and intensity of land uses along those major corridors. Those are the things that make transit work well. Those are the types of things that drive ridership. And so as we look at transit, a big part of what we're going to be doing is looking at land use and looking at density. And the future land use map, DeKalb is updating that as a part of their unified plan. The county is, and so we'll be working hand in glove with the county to look at land use and look at transit and transportation to make sure that we have some good alignment on that as we move forward. Next. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Claudia to talk about ridership.
Thank you, Grady, and good evening, everyone. And as Grady mentioned, land use drives ridership because different densities produce trips, right? So that is the reason that we're going to spend some time on this topic this evening, and that is the reason why ridership is an important focus when we talk about funding, because it is something that is important to the federal government as they choose which transit projects they will participate in, which oftentimes is discretionary grants that we have to compete for. So what you see in front of you is estimated ridership. First, looking at the 2012 locally preferred alternative. So we have tools that we use to estimate future year boardings at our stations, and those tools depend on land use forecasts of land use types in order to generate numbers, because where jobs are located and where housing is located and places that people would travel to are located, again, is what's driving our trips. So the preliminary look at the existing LPA produces about 11,300 trips at those new stations, okay? So just for comparison's sake, if you look at the entire MARTA rail system right now, the average weekday boardings are 86,300. And another comparative number is CTA, which is the heavy rail system in Chicago. That is a project that was recently funded by the federal government, and they're looking at daily boardings around 38,000. So we like to keep these numbers in mind so we understand how competitive our project is going to be. And when we look at density for transit type, there are some rules of thumb that have been developed across the country. It's really looking at how many riders are you generating, and therefore what type of investment would you need to meet that transit need. So if you look at a low density area, which as a rule of thumb would be defined as less than 15 dwelling units per acre, which is something that would be pretty common in South DeKalb, that supports a bus rapid transit type of investment. Now, if you have an increased density around a station area, where that increases the numbers to maybe 20 dwelling units per acre, a medium density investment might make more sense, right? Because you need to move more people. There's a higher demand for the transit system. And then heavy rail is really what demands the highest density in terms of justifying a return on investment. And that's looking at more like 20 to 30 dwelling units per acre and 50 or more jobs per acre. So these are just rules of thumb. There is no hard and fast rule, but this just gives you an idea of the number of trips that would be generated by these land use patterns and how that correlates to the type of transit service that might make sense. Okay. So we've talked a lot about the current conditions in the area. And as Brian mentioned, we have started the process of reevaluating options in South DeKalb. And the first thing that we did was take a look at these changes in demographics and land uses and update the information that we had from 2012 so that we can understand where we are right now. We've also been talking with stakeholders, and now we're engaging you all, the public, because it's really important that we continue to get feedback on what type of transit investment you all would like to see, what types of transit needs you have, what struggles you have with transportation, because that's going to help us transition into an evaluation of alternatives. So we have the locally preferred alternative from 2012, and we see some preliminary results. But looking at the study area that Grady shared, what else might we want to look at? Are there options in other parts of the study area along Covington Highway? Should we be looking at other modes like BRT or light rail? And how do those compare to one another in terms of a return on investment that will help us get a funding plan together, right? So that is what we're going to do next. We're going to listen to what you all have to say. Now we have a survey that we will have a link for in just a moment, and we want to get feedback from as many people as possible so that we can connect transportation needs and public desires with technical analysis and ultimately come up with an updated locally preferred alternative that the MARTA board can advance. So to that end, let's talk for a minute about specific funding sources and what some of those options are, since that is something that we need to have as a driver in our decision-making process. At the end of the day, we get the question a lot, why don't we have rail yet? Why have we been talking about this for so long and we don't have any investment? And as Grady explained, funding is something that we have to be able to show that we have in order to move this along in the federal process. So what are some of our options? Because there is a lot of money out there right now for transit projects. And I'm sure many of you have heard about the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That has sweetened the deal even more. And it's really important that we understand all of the options that we have. So one of the largest options for funding for these types of transit investments is FTA's Capital Investment Grant Program, which has over $23 billion, and it is the largest federal funding program for capital investment in major projects. It's a discretionary program, so you have to compete for the funds, and it's only going to fund a percentage of the project. There's an expectation that the locals will also have skin in the game, right? So you could see the federal government do a 50% match, and the other 50% comes from the locals, or it could be less than that. It really depends on how the project performs. And there are three categories of those projects. The two that would be most relevant here, if we end up recommending a solution similar to the existing LPA, it would be new starts, which applies to projects with capital costs in excess of $400 million, which clearly any type of heavy rail, light rail, that would fit that bill. There's also small starts, which funds capital for projects less than 400 million. So oftentimes a BRT investment will fall in that small starts bucket. There's some additional US DOT programs that are formula funds that come to the state that can be allocated to transit projects. Those are things like CMAQ, which stands for Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality. So if you have a project that's going to have a positive impact on air quality, it can get funds from that bucket of money. Same with formula funds for carbon reduction. And there's also some surface transportation block grant programs that can be used for transit projects. And with the new infrastructure bill, there's even more opportunities. There's competitive grants for a category called mega which are major transportation investments, RAISE grants, LONO, which is an emissions reduction category. But the point here is there is a lot of options, and we need to think about those now as we're doing this analysis, because it will help us advance a solution that's likely to get funding. And we've got to have funding in order to move the ball forward. So this slide represents what some of that evaluation looks like with respect to that capital investment grant bucket that I mentioned, new starts and small starts. They look at project justification as a significant part of the rating for whether or not they're willing to fund the project. And those categories include mobility improvements. So if you're helping people move around better, if the project is cost effective, so you're getting a lot of return on the investment, relieving congestion, if your land use is supportive of transit, which is why we're talking so much about density, because it matters what's in that future land use plan. If you have a future land use plan that shows that you're going to create transit supportive density near stations, you're going to score better. Economic development opportunities, we've talked about those. If there is opportunity to develop in the vicinity of transit, you're going to score better. Then the local financial commitment, as I mentioned, that skin in the game, is another significant part of that rating. So they look at the current funding commitments that are available, what you've said you're going to do, and what the likelihood is that you will really have that money. So if you've got some type of dedicated funding source or referendum, you're going to score well. If you don't have anything like that, and it's questionable where your portion of the funds are going to come from, you don't score as well. So we'll do a preliminary look at these categories once we have alternatives to advance, because it's a good way to assess whether or not we've got a competitive project. So what is next in our study? Well, I mentioned that we have a survey, and the QR code on the screen will lead you directly to that survey. The link is also available on the project website that you saw earlier on one of the slides, and we are able to share that later if you'd like. But we really need your feedback about your transportation needs and preferences, and not just you, also your South DeKalb neighbors. So we encourage you to send this far and wide to anyone you believe would have valuable insight to give, people who work here, people who live here, people who play in South DeKalb. We want everybody's input on what their transit needs and preferences are. That information is going to help us refine the purpose of being here and what it is we're trying to do. And then we can evaluate alternatives that best serve those needs. We'll come back next spring with that feedback and what we did with it. So what did we examine based on what we heard? And then hopefully by summer or fall, once we're able to look at the feedback we've gotten from everyone and continue to have conversations with the DeKalb County and the MARTA board, we'll have an updated LPA to advance. And then a really critical piece of that will be the funding strategy. What local funds could be dedicated to this, and which federal sources that we will compete for. So with that, I think we can transition to our Q&A session, and Katrina is going to help us facilitate that. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. We're going to move into the Q&A portion of the program. We'll just go back one slide, just so that way we can, yes, just keep the survey up in case anyone wants to participate. So this is where we get to it, everyone. So
Katrina,
issue.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we had a little bit of a disruption on our end. Could you back up and start over?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
We've got you now. Thank you.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay. This is where we get into the Q&A portion. And so I'm going to go ahead and read a few questions. And then if you guys have any additional questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box and we will get to your questions accordingly. What is MARTA doing to avoid cost issues leading to changes of modes as those MARTA project lists and in Clayton? What lessons have MARTA learned to expand funding pools to deliver what is initially asked for rather than changing the delivery? Brian?
Yeah, so I'll answer that. So you mentioned, the question mentions more MARTA, Atlanta, and Clayton projects, and I'm assuming here the changing of modes on some of those projects. One thing I will point out is that we've always, the entire time, MARTA has always stated that while we do see high capacity transit in these areas, that we would let the numbers and the public opinion as far as evaluation goes determine what that mode and alignment would be. So it doesn't really matter in the beginning at what's there, because essentially we still have to do the study that the FTA requires for us to pick a mode as well as an alignment. If it stays what it currently is, then that's what we go with. But if it does not warrant what's currently being slated for that area, it's hard for us to take that forward because it's not going to get a good rating. So we have to evaluate and study that. It's not necessarily that we're just switching things on our own. It's because the numbers tell us where we're going to head and what we can actually implement that is efficient, and that the federal government, who does supply some of that money, really sees as a viable project. The second part of that question, what was that again? The second part?
Sure. What lessons has MARTA learned to expand funding pools to deliver what is initially asked for rather than changing the delivery?
Yeah, I think that goes hand in hand with regards to the funding. I think Claudia talked a lot about the different funding sources that are out there today that are new, that we didn't have. So that's an expanded funding source. But if you're starting to talk about what's current out there, it's a little, we're already using the current penny on different things with the state of good repair, the current system we have. So it's a little difficult to expand funding sources from an internal and a local standpoint if it's not a referendum of some sort or some other government initiated funding source, because we do have a current system that does need to be maintained to operate it. But with the federal government, with the new infrastructure bill, there are a lot of other funding sources out there now that we are looking at and possibly could be funding sources for this project.
Thank you. The next question, what is the update for heavy rail to Stonecrest Mall? Brian?
Yeah, I answered that one as well. The update, so this is the update. And so this study right here, this is what we're intending to do right now, is determine what that mode is and what the alignment would be. We have a current LPA, so we're looking at that, ensuring that, just making sure that what we're looking at today is aligned with what the federal government would allow from a standpoint of a project that is efficient, as well as the public opinion on this. There's a lot to a project such as this. And so that's why we're going back out right now, getting your feedback, doing the analysis, so that we can come to a consensus on a mode and alignment for this area.
Thank you. Excuse me, the next question. Why has it taken so long to get rail service extended from Indian Creek to other locations further east? Brian?
I'll take that one as well. So as far as why it's taking so long, you have to think about major infrastructure projects take a long time. You also have to have funding plans in place when you're talking about projects that need federal dollars. And so if there's no local commitment, then we really, the federal government or the FTA per se here, they're not really going to move anything forward. And so without a local commitment, we can do all the planning and we can have everything in place, but without a local commitment, it's impossible for us to fund a very large project, especially in the billions, without their help. And they're not willing to move forward without any type of funding plan that allows us to do that. So And Grady, I think Grady, did you come up? Were you going to say something as well? I don't know if anybody on the team as well wants to elaborate as well, but that's kind of why a lot of times it takes a long time for projects such as this to materialize.
I think you hit it, Brian. I mean, it's really making sure that you have that funding plan in place. And over the years, I showed the timeline of all the various work and studies that occurred. But one of the big missing pieces to all of that has been a sound financial plan to advance the extension of the rail system and that BRT from downtown to Wesley Chapel. And so that's what this process is about. We're updating clearly our purpose and need. We're updating the cost. We're looking at all the demographics and all the other baseline condition information so that we can put forth a new vision for what that connection needs to be and what the transit project is, and at the same time developing a funding plan to take advantage of all the new funding sources and new opportunities that the federal government has put in place, as well as the state, and working with our local partners to identify and private partners to identify opportunities to help advance and build a project.
Yeah, lost. Still there, Katrina? Okay, well.
Can you hear me okay?
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No worries.
Why are we paying for MARTA but no rail? We've heard about density, which seems to be a moving target and narrative.
Yes.
Anyone?
Go. So I'll start with saying there is rail in DeKalb. And so that's one thing I will say. We do have rail in DeKalb as well as bus service. So you're paying for the current system, which is we do have a few stations in DeKalb as well as local bus service, as well as many of the other services that we provide from disability service, MARTA disability service, and so forth. So that is what your current penny is going to, as well as we've now had some other commitments that Grady mentioned earlier. Those commitments are coming out of the current penny. And really, when you have so many of these different things coming out, they have cost to them. And so that's where the money is going. So that's why right now, when you start talking about large infrastructure expansion projects, we've got to find another funding source locally to do that. It's just not enough money being generated at this time to build out anything else from a large expansion project standpoint. The second, I don't know if I answered the second half of that question.
It was about density, which, I mean, I can talk a little bit about that. You know, if you want to compete for federal funds, density is a factor, because density generates trips, which makes a transit investment cost effective, right? So the federal government is not likely to make a choice to spend a percentage of $6.5 billion on something that isn't going to move very many people. They have to have some type of baseline from which to make that decision. So that is why we talk about density. And the reality is that we make choices about density. That, you know, South DeKalb and DeKalb County are updating their unified plan right now. That plan looks at future land use. It drives the assumptions about future densities. So it isn't something that we're all powerless to control. If densities are going to become more transit supportive, the projects become more competitive. And that's why we keep talking about density. It's not making a judgment on whether it's better or worse to have density. It's the simple fact that to compete for the largest pot of money that can fund a transit investment, that is one of the biggest factors. I don't know, Grady, if you want to add in anything there.
Well, I think you hit it, Claudia. I do want to say that we're starting to see some changes in land use, as I stated earlier, around the Stonecrest area, for example. I mean, it is zoned currently around the mall area for pretty high density. The market, however, has not, we haven't seen the, all of that density happen, but the land use and the zoning allows for pretty significant density at the Stonecrest Mall as one example. We have opportunities for redevelopment at the South DeKalb Mall, which is along the I-20 corridor as well. So there are opportunities, and as I alluded to, and Claudia and her team was very, very involved in this, and Brian, MARTA undertook a transit-oriented development study along the I-20 corridor to identify the types of density and intensity of uses that made sense for transit. So we have a lot of information to help us with that. The county is in the position of updating their plans to be more in alignment. If we truly want high capacity transit in South DeKalb, in order for us to, as Claudia said, to get the funding we need, we're going to have some ridership and therefore some intensity and density along the corridor to make it transit supported.
Thanks, Claudia and Greg. And Grady.
Next question, Katrina.
May have lost Katrina here for a second.
Just let me know if you can hear me okay.
Yeah, there you are.
Katrina, I think you may have frozen again. Perhaps
Yeah.
turn off your video and then take it from there. Thank you.
Yeah, so with Katrina, right now, having a few technical difficulties.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It's my cord is going in and out. I apologize. I'm gonna move on to the next question if that's okay.
Yep.
Do plans encompass rapid rail transit as far as Lithonia, or better yet, as far as Conyers?
So I'll start with answering. So right now, the study area does encompass Lithonia. And so, we've always looked at Lithonia being along the I-20 corridor. It would have been an area where we would look for a station of some sort or some connectivity. So it does encompass that area. So whatever comes out of the study, we will be able to determine if that is a viable stop. That's where we're going to continue to take the alignment.
But the second half of that, Brian, I mean, beyond DeKalb
Question.
County.
How exactly would the
I think Grady's going to ask him.
Yeah, I was going to add to that, Katrina, just for clarity. We are not looking at a transit connection beyond DeKalb County. So out Rockdale and Conyers is outside of MARTA's jurisdiction.
Correct. Thanks, Grady.
Thank you. If you live in Flat Mills area, when will you have buses in this area?
So that's a question we're gonna for Flat Mills. I think we're gonna have to
Blake Mills, I believe it is Blake Mills.
I can take that one, Brian. I mean, it came up last night, and the answer to that is, and as I talked about in our previous in-person meeting, MARTA is looking at expanding its local bus service into areas like Flake Mills and Flat Shoals, Browns Mill, the whole area that does have no bus service. As a part of the DeKalb County Transit Master Plan, the need for services in those areas came up in every single public meeting we had. It was identified as a major need. To start the process of expanding service into those areas, MARTA is looking at creating these transit bus-to-bus transfer facilities that allows them to expand their local buses further into DeKalb. Right now, the MARTA bus operations are really focused on feeding the rail system. And historically, MARTA's never really had bus-to-bus transfer for facilities. So when they build these, the one at Stonecrest Mall, and then also the one at South DeKalb, which are in the short-term plan to come online, it will allow MARTA then to use those as a launching pad for extending service further south into DeKalb County, into the areas mentioned. That allows for the operators to have places where they can take a break. It allows for the service to be expanded further. So there is an identified need. MARTA is well aware of it, and MARTA is beginning to put in the infrastructure to make that expansion happen.
Grady, I'd just like to add to that for MARTA. We are also working on the bus network redesign project, which is revisiting, reimagining our entire bus network throughout our 3-county service area. So I will post a link to the website with much more information about that effort, so everyone can get engaged with that when we come back out, probably early to mid next year. Thank you.
The second part to that also, why is the connection so long from the train station to 5 Point Station as well as the north and south?
I guess well, when you say long, I'm assuming this is time, from a time perspective. And if we're answering from a time perspective, well, between each, you have stops between each alignment. So there are multiple stops between. So you're gonna have a little longer length of time to expect if it's not such as a express route where you're skipping stops. So I'm assuming that we're answering to time. I don't know if the team has any other thoughts on that.
I could ask, would you like me to, Gloria, are you able to ask your question to the team while we have you here? She's the one who asked the question. She could specify if she's able to come off mute for a second. Gloria, are you able to? If not, we'll have to move on. Okay.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yes, I'm speaking in reference to the time. I have been riding MARTA since MARTA started. And back in the 70s and the 80s, the time was much faster. And now that you have the train system, you would think everything would be a lot faster. Because what I used to do, I would catch the bus and then catch the train. And the time to commute would be anywhere between 3 to 4 hours. And so that's what the question I'm asking, why they don't just, instead of having the bus and the train on the same schedule or whatever, and you have to sit 30 minutes and then go, then you're on the train breakdown. The commute is terrible.
Okay, understood. And thank you for your comment. And some of that, as you kind of alluded to, we've added service, we've added other stops in areas, so that kind of gets to the point of there being more stops in certain areas where time gets extended because we do have to stop. And I heard a few things in there. You mentioned maybe some mechanical issues here and there, and so making sure that we're continuing to perform maintenance and things of that nature to make sure our trains and our buses are operating efficiently. Those are things we continue to work on. But as far as the commute from previous to today, it really all depends on the ridership demand and the number of stops we need to add to make sure that we're meeting that demand. We don't currently have express service where we can skip some of those stops to speed that up on those routes you may mention. But that's really what it boils down to. We're having to make those stops because there is a ridership demand in those areas.
Hey, Brian, I'll add a little bit to that, and just to kind of be totally transparent about the pandemic and COVID. And so MARTA did sort of contract the service because of that. And I think the chair talked about this the other night. I mean, we're beginning to roll the service back out. So that could have also an impact on the longer commute times and wait times for the bus. So that's an important piece to keep in front of us. And as Greg had alluded to about the network redesign, I mean, MARTA's really looking, as commuting patterns are changing, bringing forth service that kind of really aligns with the way people are traveling today. So that could have a part to do with why your commute is longer as well. But MARTA's taking a look at that and will be bringing back online, has brought back online, and will continue to bring back service as we move forward.
And can I just add one more thing to that? Thank you, Grady. We are trying to bring folks back. We have a shortage, as other transit agencies across the country are also experiencing. And so, as I think Chair Scott mentioned last night, we're hiring. Not to steal what she said, but I may as well. We are hiring drivers, and the more that we can get on and get trained is the more that we can bring back more frequency. What we tried to do is make sure that we could bring back all of our routes, but unfortunately, because of the shortage, they're not as frequent right now. But that is something that we're working on. But thank you for noting that.
Okay, moving on. Commitment of funds. How does our millions of tax dollars funds commitment?
So I kind of mentioned earlier, the commitment of funds right now, your 1 cent sales tax right now, it really goes to infrastructure of today, of what we've built in previous times. So we have to maintain that. So that's the current heavy rail system, that as well as the bus service that we currently receive in DeKalb County. So that does take capital in order to maintain. And so those are things that your current 1 cent that is going to, as well as Grady alluded to in that earlier, we do have other infrastructure projects that we are building, some of our transit hubs that will come out of that money as well. But again, that is not enough right now to fund a very large infrastructure project when you're talking about getting into $500 million or more. There has to be some other funding source to couple with an federal government funding source in order for us to build a expansion project at this time.
Claudia, could you take us back to that, the current commitments in DeKalb County, and just take another quick run through that? I think that would be helpful for this question as well.
Yep.
Thank you.
Here we go. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I don't know if Claudia or Grady want to.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Brian, and I think you hit the first one really hard. State of good repair, and that's just not an issue here in Atlanta. Our system is 40 years old or more in some cases, and that's a huge issue. And the federal government is really focused on safety and making sure that these systems operate efficiently. We have some of our other peer transit agencies really dealing with major issues. WMATA system in DC is an example where they have significant safety issues because of the age of the system and the need and the capital that goes into making sure that the system operates safely. So we want to make sure we have a state of good repair on our system here in Atlanta, and MARTA is really focusing in on that. That takes a lot of the capital dollars because of the age. There's a commitment to building 150 shelters, as I mentioned earlier, to make that last mile, first mile kind of connection to the local bus service more convenient, more safe, taking people out of the weather. We've heard from CEO Michael Thurman how important that is for folks that really depend on MARTA to get to and from work, school, church, whatever the trip they're making those trips more convenient, more safe, and making them more reliable. The station rehab kind of goes hand in glove again with the state of good repair. We have stations that have roofing issues. We have tile. We have a lot of as our stations have gotten old, MARTA is taking a look at that and making significant investments, bringing these stations up to today's standards. So there's some rehab going on, and two of the major rehab projects right off the bat is in DeKalb County in South DeKalb at Indian Creek and Kensington. New services along Buford Highway and Candler Road. Those are really good bus markets now with pretty significant ridership. On the 39 is the highest ridership route in the MARTA system along Buford Highway. So beginning to look at new types of service that makes more frequent bus service along those corridors is something MARTA is committed to doing. I've talked about the hubs at South DeKalb and at Stonecrest, those bus-to-bus transfer facilities. And again, those as those come online, those are going to allow MARTA to extend its local bus service into areas where we don't have local bus service that we've heard about time and time again. Browns Mill, Flat Shoals, those areas that are growing and people really need service, will be able to serve those better. And then the rest of this is really more about, some of the planning work and the work that this study is doing to advance those larger transit investments, such as the I-285 BRT, or this project once we identify the preferred opportunity, and then continuing to work with the county and local governments on the density and the intensity so that we can bring forth a project that's competitive. These are commitments that are made, and MARTA's making a lot of headway on. And these are things that are being paid for mainly out of the existing 1 cent sales tax that DeKalb, Fulton County, and the city and Clayton are all putting into the MARTA system.
Okay. Please address justification for this huge expenditure of money for HRT at a time when mass transit ridership has so drastically declined as a result of the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, so one thing I'll say, HRT is just one of the modes we're looking at. It was heavy rail transit, which is one of the modes which we're looking at for this project. This study will be the justification of whatever we decide as a public, as a stakeholder, as an agency, as a region, what makes sense to move forward in the South DeKalb area. And so the justification will come at the end of this study. And what that is, whether it's HRT, light rail, or BRT, we will have the information and the numbers to back to take to the federal government to receive a share of funding.
Thank you. I am looking at the next question. They're coming in. Let's see. Will there be any TOD specific zoning around these potential stations, whether it's BRT or HRT?
So to answer your question, holistically, yes. I don't know about zoning. I think zoning, we'll continue to work with DeKalb, the county on the zoning piece, but yes. What that is, we don't know yet because we don't have the alignment, but that is the thought process for us to have TOD around the stations.
Are there estimates using post-pandemic ridership data?
So the ridership number that we shared this evening, that 11,800, it is a currently calibrated model, so it would account for the pandemic. Yes.
Thank you. Here, I'm also a co-owner of Aztec Cycles, a bicycle shop. And firstly, thank you, Marta, for making sure that bicycle racks on your buses, but also will you all be expanding any service to and from into downtown area of Stone Mountain?
I think that goes hand in hand with our bus redesign. And so we are, as Greg alluded to, we are looking at bus redesign and where our service goes. If we were to need to expand service there, I'm sure we would find a way to do that. I think that's all part of that redesign, though. I can't answer that question at this moment, if that is going to take place or not.
Thank you. Is it possible for DeKalb to have a funding referendum in 2024? Are the commissioners supporting this effort?
That is a good question. I'll ask the team from a standpoint. There's a few different things that have to take place, particularly around HB 930. I have to remember. If that's
yeah, Brian, I'll take that. And you know, we don't know. We can't answer for DeKalb County.
Right.
That's a decision that the county has to make. As I alluded to in my presentation, there have been discussions at the Public Works and Infrastructure Committee around the need for additional funding for transit. And then there are a number of local governments in DeKalb County that are all advocating for additional funding for transit. But the decision to go to referendum and when and where and how is a decision that will need to be made by the DeKalb County Board of Commissioners.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. And I think we've made it pretty clear here that we do need some form of local funding commitment, whether that's a referendum or some other form. In order to build out these expansion projects, we do need some form of other local commitment. So as Grady alluded to, that is a DeKalb County decision at this point.
The question is, when does the current MARTA sales tax expire?
I can jump in on that real quick. So kind of MARTA's whole, establishment is under state law known as the 15th Amendment. And that was extended a few years ago to the year 2057. So the current sales tax that supports MARTA expires in 2057 unless it's otherwise renewed before then.
Thank you, Greg.
Okay, another question. How does the overlay districts on I-20 and for Stonecrest play into the ridership numbers? The overlay allows for greater density than what the underlying zoning allows. Do you run the ridership numbers on the overlay opportunity or the underlying zoning?
Now, ask Claudia O'Grady, want to answer that?
I'll start, and I'm sure Claudia will want to jump in, and I can guess where that question came from. Mr. Lee May. The answer to that is that the way the ridership models work is that they are more predicated or focused on the land use and not zoning. And so you're right, there is an overlay district there along the corridor of I-20. That's one of the things that could help with encouraging the development and intensity and density to happen. But the model that we use to generate the ridership is really more based on the future land use plan and not the zoning. So the answer is at this point, it's based on future land use. And we'll need to, but we do have the opportunity as we refine the model and make adjustments to consider, better consider the overlay.
Next question is, what is meant when you refer to local funding? Is it the county for all DeKalb County? Is it South DeKalb? What specifically does it mean?
Yeah, so right now when we talk about local funding, we're talking about the county of DeKalb, not a specific area of DeKalb. There are special tax districts and things of that nature out there as well, but I think right now what we're talking about is local funding coming out of the county. I don't know if anybody else wants to elaborate on any other possibilities, but that's what we're talking about at the moment.
Yeah, I'll add in a little bit for clarity, Brian, but you're right on. When we talk about local funding in context to MARTA, we're talking about, as Greg talked about earlier, the 1 cent sales tax that goes to MARTA. So that's a local funding source that funds MARTA right now. There is the ability for counties within the state of Georgia and within Metro Atlanta to increase their contribution to transit. They can go up to an additional penny. In fact, the city of Atlanta increased their MARTA contribution from 1 penny to 1.5 pennies to help advance projects in the city. So when we're talking about local funding, in most cases, we're talking about a sales tax of sorts. As Brian said, there are other funding opportunities as well that can be brought to bear on the local side. That could be tax allocation districts. There could be opportunity for even private sector participate in bringing public transit projects forward. So public-private partnerships are typically what those are called. So we're going to be looking at all of that when we develop our funding plan and funding strategy for this project.
Thank you, Grady.
We have a question. The subject matter was for South DeKalb, not DeKalb. We don't have the high tower office buildings, but we have residents that are taxpayers. Why aren't taxes that fund MARTA based on usage and current density?
If I understand correctly, the question is centering around why aren't we spending funds in the areas based on usage and current density. That's actually what we do. We our bus network redesign, that is all about where do people ride. And so we're redesigning our network based on where the ridership is, the usage. As far as density goes, MARTA, we build our system again, and we have to look at density. We build our system around density. We haven't done an expansion project in a while. And so Summer Hill BRT will be one of our first in years. And so again, these expansion projects, they do center around density. Even our previous build outs here for the current system, they had some density associated with it and why we built them in the areas that we did. So that's actually how we do build out projects and fund projects at the moment.
Brian, I'll add to that one too, if you don't mind. That's a great question, and I think the second piece of it around the density, current density and usage, and as I stated earlier, one of the things MARTA is really focused on is the current situation in South DeKalb, which is really, as we heard the other night, about the need for services, local bus services where we don't have any, and people that really depend on, could really need transportation, doesn't have an option. So beyond just building a high capacity transit project, be it along I-20 or Covington Highway, there's a need for local bus service to get people to and from school, doctors. We've gone to several meetings where I mentioned the folks that are aging in place. If you don't have a local bus route, you don't get the MARTA mobility service or the paratransit service. So we got a lot of folks that, elderly folks that need in South DeKalb, not specifically in South DeKalb, that can't get to Emory for healthcare or can't get to DeKalb Medical. So there are a lot of needs in the immediate, in the current, that the bus network redesign is really focused on, and some the transit hubs that I talked about, and the need for new local bus service or the micro transit is a big part of what MARTA is trying to address beyond the high capacity transit, things that are problems today in the current.
Thank you, Grady.
Next question. Do you think MARTA is inexperienced in the sense of extending heavy rail from any of the DeKalb end of line stations? I guess more specifically Indian Creek in this case. And inexperienced in the sense that it has been over 20 years since the last HRT expansion.
Yeah, I don't think it's inexperienced. MARTA, we have within MARTA internally very smart individuals who have been around a long time, have been a part of heavy rail extensions in other parts of the country, have been doing engineering and planning work for years. So I don't think it's about inexperience when you're talking about extending the heavy rail. And we also have consultants who also have the same experience as well. But at the end of the day, for heavy rail, you have to realize there right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, Grady or Claudia, there are only 2 heavy rail extension projects in the country. Heavy rail is quickly becoming a mode of transportation that's very expensive, that people feel, do you get the bang for your buck? And can you put in more high capacity, a different high capacity transit mode that will allow you to build out other projects as well? So I don't think it's more about inexperience, but it's more about the cost increase as it continues to go up for a mode of transportation such as heavy rail. And you see that across our MARTA system as we start to look at other routes which could utilize BRT or light rail, which are at this point are less costly than our heavy rail systems.
Yeah, I'll just add, Brian, I mean, in addition to being less costly, those other modes are quicker to implement. So in communities where you have a transit need that you want to address quickly, you can implement BRT or light rail in a significantly shorter period of time than a heavy rail extension. And because of different operating characteristics, you often have less community impacts that might be perceived as negative. So there's lots of factors, but it is true that heavy rail is becoming less common in terms of capital expansion.
Thank you, Claudia.
Next question. What work is being done to ensure at future GDOT projects don't interfere or conflict with MARTA projects?
Work's being done. So one of the things we are doing right now with GDOT, we started monthly meetings with GDOT. We have different meetings with them to really enforce collaboration. I will say one of the things we did see when we went to San Diego here recently and took a delegation is that collaboration is key. And so what we are doing, we are meeting with GDOT on a regular basis, talking about these potential projects that could conflict with each other. So in hopes of that, we can all continue to work together in a sense so that we can build projects that both agencies see benefit in, and the ridership, whether it's on the highway or whether it's in transit, we get people to where they need to go.
Thank you. Next question. This is off what is being discussed, but what does MARTA consider Metro Atlanta? In the only counties in the MARTA system that is considered, or are there more counties aside from Gwinnett, of course, that MARTA has considered previously or recently?
Katrina, could you please repeat the question? I think it got a little bit garbled on our end, please. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Okay, so the question is, what does MARTA consider Metro Atlanta? Is it Cobb? Is it Fulton? Is it DeKalb or Clayton? The only counties in the MARTA system that is considered, or are there more counties aside from Gwinnett, of course, that MARTA has considered previously or recently?
Brian, I can jump into this if you'd like, or.
Yeah, I mean, you can go ahead.
Sure. Well, for MARTA's purposes, I just want to be very clear. MARTA's service area is 3 counties. That is DeKalb County, Clayton County, and Fulton County, which also includes the city of Atlanta, of course. So that is our service area. That said, we recognize we're a critical part of a regional transportation system. We have very close coordination and integration with other county transit systems, such as Gwinnett County Transit, Cobb County Transit, which is now called Cobb Link, as well as with Georgia Regional Transportation Authority, which operates the Greta Express buses. There have been some various efforts over the past few years in Gwinnett with referenda put to voters to consider joining the MARTA system. Those have not been successful the last couple of times. We will work closely with any counties in the future that are interested in joining the MARTA system, but for our purposes, all of our plans are focused on our 3 current counties.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks.
Okay, excuse me, next question. Finally, the DeKalb commissioners voted to extend the MARTA tax in 2008 to expire in 2057, I believe. This approval was made with the explicit commitment to make I-20 rail expansion priority in its list of projects. That is the only reason the tax was extended in DeKalb. Now it appears that there is a move to change the LPA through the process. No, it's not stately explicit, but it is pretty clear. So unfortunately, there is a lack of trust when it comes to this process.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your comment. I'd have to go back and look myself at the mode. I'm not sure if, is it 2008, Greg? Do you remember?
Yeah, that's, and Greg spoke to this earlier. I mean, this question is really predicated on the 15th Amendment to the Rapid Contract and Assistance Agreement, of which DeKalb approved with all of the other jurisdictions. In that 15th Amendment, there are various exhibits or that lay out what the commitments are. I went through those in that slide earlier. The commitment to continue to investigate high-capacity transit connections in DeKalb is clearly a part of that amendment, which was approved by the commission. So, I think that this process itself is all about making true to that commitment and continuing to look for the best investment for South DeKalb high capacity transit. So that's how I read what we're doing. That's what this process is all about, and is MARTA's part of upholding that part of the 15th Amendment. Greg, do you want to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it, Grady. Thank you.
Yeah, no, agreed. Thank you, Grady. I couldn't remember high capacity transit, as Grady mentioned. This, we are committed to studying that, and that's what we're doing. So thank you for that, Grady.
Next question. Does MARTA recognize that it is the only HRT system in the South and can take full advantage of that use case as the city it's coupled with is also experiencing rapid growth that far outweighs what the MARTA system was originally built for? And at what point does MARTA believe it will be at capacity numbers-wise, barring the pandemic/recession we are in now, that will almost certainly warrant the need for an extension, HRT, LRT, BRT, et cetera, in the future?
So, yeah, so we do recognize that we are one of the, or the only HRT system in the South. However, when you start talking about taking full advantage of this, it still really boils down to, do we have the density? Do we have a funding commitment in that certain area that we're trying to expand HRT? And if we don't have that, that advantage of us only having the HRT in the South doesn't really matter, because we don't have the numbers behind to prove that we're warranting an expansion of HRT, or warranting that the federal government put in a 60% or 50 or whatever it is share for us to expand heavy rail. So it is a good distinction, but there are limitations to that distinction as well.
I'd also just like to note, when it comes to capacity, as far as our existing heavy rail system, we can carry a heck of a lot more people than we do now. Yeah. This system, when it was designed and built in the 70s, essentially it can handle 2-minute headways. We can run as many trains full of people, I think, that this region can throw at us. But really, it's just a matter of having all of that supportive land use and density and population. But there is not a capacity issue on the heavy rail system.
Hey, I got to add in there too, Brian. I like the distinction of being the only HRT system, but the South does include Miami, and Miami does have an HRT system as well, same vintage as MARTA. So we're not the only one, and they're having very similar issues that we're having here in Atlanta. And to Greg's point, I mean, the system can carry a lot more people. And even when we look at what's in the ground today and what's around some of the existing MARTA stations in terms of transit supportive land use, there are a number of stations that are seas of parking, empty parking. So there's an opportunity to repurpose that parking, and MARTA is doing a very good job at that through its TOD initiatives, which again makes the system work better and allows the city to continue to grow. So we have a lot of capacity and a lot of opportunity on what we have. And then as we look at the extensions, we need to kind of take the same lens and make sure that we're considering that we have the land use and the density, the ridership, and that it's cost effective.
Great.
Grady, that might be a good transition into, I think, one of the remaining questions here as far as TOD specific zoning. I think it might be helpful first just to make sure we explain TOD, what that means. That refers to transit-oriented development. And MARTA has our own transit-oriented development program surrounding our stations, where we develop, in most cases, kind of underused parking lots to support higher density and affordable housing right next to our system. But the question is, will there be TOD specific zoning around potential stations, whether it's BRT or HRT? And so maybe someone from the team can give a bit of a description of kind of that transit supportive land use study process that we go through for these kinds of projects.
Yeah, I can jump in if first, and then others can chime in too. But we did a I-20 East transit-oriented development specific study for the station sites associated with the existing LPA back around 2018. That was a pilot study actually funded by the Federal Transit Administration, and it was done in partnership with DeKalb County. And as part of that effort, we had community conversations. Some of you may have participated about those station sites and the mix of uses and densities that would be scalable and appropriate for the community, and also impact positive ridership on the system, regardless of mode, whether it is BRT or HRT. And as a result, there were some recommendations put forth as to the types of land use and zoning changes that you might need to put in place. But at the end of the day, I mean, land use and zoning decisions are made by either DeKalb County or the city jurisdiction in which those station locations reside. So all of those entities were involved in those conversations and make choices about what is actually implemented. But there has been investment made in analyzing what some potential solutions are that would improve transit-oriented land uses around the station sites. I don't know, Brian or Grady, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think you covered it from my perspective, Claudia. Thank you.
Wait, I'd also like to note that we have a lot of the supporting documents from that land use planning effort that are posted on the project website. We'll get that posted in the chat so that you can go back and see the different presentations and studies for that effort.
Next question. What do you think is the reason for the major slowdown and eventual pause of MARTA's expansion on the red, yellow, gold, blue, and green lines? Everything up until 2001 was a new station or new line every few years, and then it just stopped. Was it suburban opposition? Was it lack of continual funding? Metro Atlanta's growth and the surrounding counties at the time feeling the current system was good enough, or just a lack of support from communities?
Well, I think, again, we kind of talked about this earlier with regards to expansion projects and the amount of capital dollars that are available for an expansion project. These projects are expensive. And if you have to maintain a system that does have the ridership we have, or at least had before the pandemic, and what we envision getting back to and beyond, it does take a lot of money or a lot of capital to maintain that. So again, if you're talking about expanding heavy rail, the blue, gold, red lines, you're going to need a little more capital funding buckets to do that. And so that's, I'll say that right now from a standpoint of what's taking place. I don't know if Greg or Shelley had anything on that as well.
I don't, Brian. Thank you.
No.
Next question. Has DeKalb made any land use and zoning decisions relative to the TOD study? Those changes could improve ridership numbers.
I think DeKalb has really taken a look at what we did do in that study. As we did, there was a couple of studies going on at the same time with DeKalb. And so I think they did take a look at that, and they've made the best decisions based on what we looked at MARTA and what they've gathered themselves. And so I can't answer that directly because I'm not the county, but we did work hand in hand with regards to the couple of studies that were going on at the same time around looking at land use.
There are no specific questions left in the Q&A box.
Okay. Well, excellent. What I'll say is we really appreciate you all taking the time to hear what we have to say today, and we really appreciate your feedback and questions. We hope that you continue to ask your neighbors, as well as you have any more questions, take the survey and ask them to take the survey themselves and provide their feedback as well as we continue to move this process forward. I will say we will be back to the public as we continue to move and get more data as we get closer to making some decisions. And again, feel free to reach out to us via email or the website or any other means that you may see fit. And so that we may be able to help you and answer some questions. And so with that, I don't know, I think we can close it out for tonight.
Brian, do we
Looks like,
want to, I'm sorry, I think
Chairman-
there's one more question we
Another
wanted
question.
to try to squeeze in here. I apologize. This
And
is
then
just,
Chairwoman Scott would like to, she has her hand raised as well, following that.
okay, so this is just a question asking us to just explain a little bit more about the cost increase from 2018 to 2022 and just some of the factors behind that. So thank you.
I can jump in if you want me to, Brian. There's a couple things that have impacted costs. In the slide that Grady showed up front, one of the biggest impacts on the LPA since 2012 has been GDOT's decision to build managed lanes in the corridor. So in 2012, there was an assumption that we would be able to use existing right-of-way that belonged to GDOT. But it belongs to GDOT and they have first right of refusal on that right of way. And when they decided to use that to build additional lanes, that pushes us outside of right of way, and right of way costs can be significant. So that's part of it. We also, as many of you all know, are in a period of rising construction costs due to materials costs, supply chain issues, and inflation. So right now, costs are high. So those are a couple of the things that have impacted the cost from what we saw originally. We also have to think about secondary investments that arise as a result of a major capital investment, like if we are to extend the rail from Indian Creek Station, there is a need to reconfigure some of the existing station site. So as we get more specific in those types of costs, that also impacts cost increases. So those are the major factors.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you. Now we'll wrap it up. Sorry about that. Thank you.
No worries. We'll hand it off to Chairwoman Rita Scott. Closes out.
Thank you so much. And I hope that I just want to comment on several things that were said that I think would allow those that are participating on this call to leave with a projection and a vision of where we expect to be. First of all, I want everyone to know that MARTA has what's called a Riders Advisory Council that meets once a month, and issues and concerns from riders are listened to and their suggestions are taken into place. Stonecrest has a resident that is part of the Riders Advisory Council. So we're listening to Stonecrest as well as the other members of the other jurisdictions, but there is specifically a Stonecrest resident that is part of the Riders Advisory Councils that has shared with us concerns and information, and this council meets once a month. So I want you to know that we're listening to your concerns here in South DeKalb. One of the other things, the questions regarding a transit-oriented development in South DeKalb, there is a transit-oriented development that's actually taking place at the Indian Creek train station now. So if you have time or the opportunity, drive by, take a look at the construction that's going on, And please be aware that we understand that we want to make sure in DeKalb, we're available, that we are bringing public transit to the community. We're looking at what we can do to offset any areas that are not being served. The whole purpose is to make sure that we serve not only the other jurisdictions, but specifically DeKalb. So please, if you have a chance, go by, look at the transit-oriented development that's being built at this time in Indian Creek. And the one thing I want to say about dollars that a lot of people don't understand is that the pandemic happened. And I must say, we had some concern about transit that was promised in another area that had not taken place, and we had to go back and reevaluate. What I did as the chair was to ask the state revenue department to look at what tax dollars were projected and what tax dollars was actually realized. And the tax dollars projected is not what we realized. And of course, that had to do with the fact that we went through 2.5 years of a pandemic. So what I'm saying is we're looking forward. The great thing is that in DeKalb, we have a congressman that sits on the Federal Transportation Committee, and that's Congressman Hank Johnson. And we're in consistent conversation with him about how and what we can do to support public transit in South DeKalb and in DeKalb County, period. So with that being said, I hope it somehow both would bring some pulse to what I'm saying, that you would understand that we understand the heartbeat of the community is transit, and we're working to do whatever we can to serve South DeKalb as well as all of DeKalb with the transit that it needs to be, the community that it needs to be. So thank you for allowing me to share that.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And with that, I think that is a great close. Again, we thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next meeting. And please don't forget to take our survey, as well as have your neighbors take it as well. So thank you, and I hope everyone have a great rest of your night.